Another truck frame repair, log truck, 99 model International. This area that I'm working on has been repaired before. It was pretty poorly done. Let's take a look. I got started on it here. The area we're looking at is right behind these air tanks. Huge break in the frame. It's more than half the frame by the time you consider the amount of crack that's cracked through right here and the distance that it's cracked underneath. Only got about 3/4 of an inch or an inch left here at the end, and it'd be all the way through. And you see this plate that was added. And then if we look around the back and look to see what happened before they put that on there, right there we can see this double frame still broke. They did absolutely nothing to fix the frame. If you look up inside of there, I don't know if I can show you this or not. Yeah. See, up in there, all the way up to those bolt holes, that frame's still broke in too. The double frame here, it was left broken too when this piece was added. Bear with me a second. Now, one huge no-no right here: don't ever weld vertically on a frame. If you make some kind of a plate you're going to weld on a frame, you can zigzag, you can do a curl, you can do a pattern like a V, whatever you do, you don't ever weld vertical on a frame. We've also got a crack back here, obviously in the back. It's doing the same thing. Not sure how good you can see that crack, but it's doing exactly the same thing back here. Just to the outside of where that's welded, it's cracked. And the way they did this, they made this plate and they bolted it on there quite a bit. The bracket that's holding these air tanks, all of those holes are drilled through the plate. And then there was 4 more bolts, 1, 2, 3, 4, that are bolted, sandwiching all that together. Now what I've done so far, obviously, you know, the ultimate way to do this would be to completely remove that plate, weld the frame back together, put the plate back on, and weld the plate back on with ends that aren't straight up and down. Now, for a 23-year-old log truck, that's not going to happen. That's way too extensive of a repair. We're going to have to do and try to, you know, make a repair that's the best we can make in a reasonable amount of time. What I've started doing here is right there, there, and there. You'll see those bigger holes. They're 15/16 holes. And I drilled them through the outer plate that was added later. I drilled through the next piece of frame, and then I stopped. So I'll be plug welding completely through them holes to tie those frame pieces into this plate. I started drilling a hole right there, and I realized I hit another hole that was in there for some reason, and I stopped because I wanted a full hole. So we'll be welding that up too. I'm not sure what I'm going to do on these holes, if I'm going to make them bigger and weld them, or if I'm going to leave them that size and weld them. But before I plug weld these big holes that I just mag drilled, I'll put the bolts back in those 4 spots and squash that plate together as much as I can. The other part of this repair is going to be carbon arcing this weld out, carbon arcing that crack out, welding the crack front and back both, and then doing something here so that the end of this plate is not welded vertically. Going to give you a look at it right there, and then we'll see what we come up with later. Good morning. It's early. Getting going on this again. Now, these 4 bolts that I said was in here before, I had to take those out to do the mag drilling that I wanted to do. I wouldn't have been able to put that mag drill flat on this frame with these bolts here, but the reason I'm sticking them back in here, I'm sticking them back in place, and I'm going to be taking some scrap metal and tacking on them like this. And the reason I'm doing that is because once these are tacked together 2 and 2, I'm going to put these on the back side of this frame and put nuts out here on the outside, and I'll be using this flat bar to keep those from turning. I don't want them to turn on the inside, and then that'll let me focus on trying to use an impact gun to tighten these and pull this frame together as much as possible. If you look inside of these holes, mostly at the bottom, there's a gap. There's a gap between that innermost plate and these other parts, and I want to try and squeeze that gap together as much as I can. I'm going to use those bolts to do that. Now with them 4 bolts back in there, and they're as tight as I can get them, I'm going to be plug welding. I'm going to be plug welding these holes, these bigger holes I drilled. I'm going to be plug welding those shut. And the key component of doing this is, you got to bear in mind that I need to do a bunch of gouging and cutting on this outer frame, but the framing here that's here, it's still holding this damn truck up. So by plug welding that piece of frame, that completely interior frame, to the centerpiece, and then plug welding that to the plate that they put on the outside, I'm at least going to have something on there that's holding this thing together while I'm doing the work on this outer frame that's obviously been taking the load, because if it hadn't been taking the load, it wouldn't be cracked like that. I've noticed here, not only did we have this crack that goes up and down and underneath, but there's a horizontal crack right here that goes all the way back to there. So next is plug welding those holes and just trying to have that as something that could help hold this in place. Doing this plug welding over top some of the airlines and stuff down there, you can see I got cardboard in here. The thing you hear a lot about with welding, people will say, Oh, if you're going to weld right there, cover that with fire blanket. And what they're talking about when they use the term fire blanket, they're talking about these fiberglass blankets that are for sale at a lot of welding supplies and stuff. It's sold because fiberglass, everybody has the idea in their mind that fiberglass doesn't burn, which it doesn't. But there's two things about fiberglass. It does melt. Fiberglass melts, and it melts at a lower temperature than molten metal. You know, molten steel will melt through fiberglass. So, although you can get some degree of protection by using these blankets, if you continue to burn steel over top of a fiberglass, what they call fire blanket, you'll melt through it eventually. You know, I've destroyed plenty of stuff myself just by way of thinking that it was being protected by one of those fire blankets. So it will melt. The fiberglass fire blankets will melt through. And there's another thing to consider about those fiberglass fire blankets, and that is they won't absorb water. This cardboard I'm using is a multi-layered material that's absorbent. I've got a water hose right here, and where I'm welding on this, every once in a while there'll be some spatter balls, and I'll put some water on my cardboard here. Every little while, you know, I don't have to spray crazy hard at it. Just, you know, spray on there and dampen it. As I dampen this cardboard, you know, and it being a multi-layered product that's absorbent, it's absorbing that water. And then there's water in between the layer that I got wet and the next layer that's wet. And as I keep spraying it and it keeps getting wetter, see, when this molten material lands on it, it cools it. That doesn't happen with fire blanket. You can't get it to absorb water, and you can't get it to cool molten metal on contact like you can this cardboard. And the other thing is, if you want a fire blanket, you got to buy it. This cardboard was free. It come from who knows what. Some Amazon package probably. So just a quick note on that, and I'm going to get back to plug welding my holes. So those first plug welds there are all done. So just to like recap what we're looking at here, you know, this outer plate that somebody put on there to fix where this frame was originally broke, it's going from here to there, but where these double frames are completely broke is right in here. The both inner and outer sections of this original truck frame was left broken too behind this plate right here, which was a bad doozer. They shouldn't have done that. And, you know, I'll say again, if this was a new truck, or if we could go into fixing this to the extent that it should be done, this air tank system needs removed. All the air lines need to be removed. That plate that they put on there would need to be cut off. Both broken sections of frame would need to be gouged out, pressed together where they're back in perfect alignment, welded. That's two of those that would have to be welded, and then a plate put back on with fish mouth shape or something at the end of it, welded, and then all of these holes re-drilled, and the air tank is simply put back on. But like I said before, on a 23-year-old truck, we're not doing that. You're probably gonna, you know, I'm gonna do things that I'm just gonna make it work and try not to take forever on it. I want to get this truck fixed today, you know, is what I'm saying. And you've got a 3-day repair here if you wanted to fix this, what they would call fixing it right. You know, like if this was a brand new truck with a broken frame, that's, you know, that's how far you'd have to go into it. We're not going to do that. And With these plug welds on each side of where that's broke, now for the first time, the absolute intersection of this double frame system is actually holding something. It's sort of like I've got those 4 or 5 big bolts going all the way through, plus the 4 bolts that we put back in there that they had in there. But it looks like with so many bolts that whoever put this plate on was counting on those bolts to hold some of the load on this frame, and bolts don't do that. They just don't. They'll allow too much movement. So anyway, with those plug welds there, that's getting it held together where I'm not worried about anything coming apart. And I was getting ready to see what I wanted to do, or my next step as far as gouging this out, and I noticed these holes. There's one right there, and there's one over there that's pretty big. I haven't looked behind that one, but I did look behind this one, and there's nothing there that would cause me any problems welding. So before I go any further, I'm going to put something behind this, and I'm going to weld that. I'm going to weld that because this is another place that I can tie that inner frame into the outer frame to try and help this thing hold. And like I've said before on double frames, I'm not crazy about welding them together. Normally I wouldn't. They really should flex amongst the two. But this is something where we got to make this thing hold and get it to haul logs as quickly as possible. And if I can gain that strength right there, that's what I'm going to do, because, you know, they've already done something extremely wrong by leaving that frame broke in behind there. And there's nothing we're going to be able to do about that right now. So I'm going to weld that up to give me another plug weld to help hold this together. Plug welded those big existing holes in the frame in front of and behind that plate. Plug welded them solid, like I did these with 7018. That ties that inner frame and the outer frame together. And on these plug welds, we got the inner frame, the outer frame, and the plate plug welded together. Next up, that weld that they put on the front and back of the plate, I'm going to gouge that out with the arc gouge, carbon arc. So where we're at with this now, with those cracks gouged out and welded up with 7018, all those plug welds are made. Several spots we got those plug welds. So the next thing that I'm going to want to do is try to do something that'll fight against the fact that this is welded straight up and down. Like I always say, you don't ever weld straight up and down on a frame. Now, in this being cracked the way it was, I had to weld straight up and down to weld the crack that was there. But like, what am I going to do about it now? I'm going to try to change the shape of that weld by putting more weld on it in a bit of a Z or V or a U, some kind of pattern that's not straight up and down on that frame. Generally, the way you would weld on a frame, or the electrode you would use on a frame, would be a 7018. That's the bread and butter, highest elasticity. It's got the flux that will purify steel. 7018 is that's the best you're going to get, and that's the 7018 is what I welded all of that up with. All that plug welding and all those cracks I welded up, I did that with a 7018. I'm going to put the 7018 away now. I'm going to switch to a 3/16 arc 80 pipe rod. That's not really for welding on truck frames, but obviously in this situation, I'm going to be doing some stuff that is just going to be done in a way that gets the job done, makes it work, because, you know, we're fixing something screwed up anyway, and we need to do it in a relatively short period of time. So let me show you these rods. Like I said, this is an 1/8 inch 7018. And based on its size of 1/8 inch and the fact that this rod needs to be run vertical up, 1/8 inch 7018 is about the biggest rod that you would run in an uphill fashion on material the thickness of that frame. This is a 3/16 arc 80. And the first thing you might notice is it's a whole lot bigger rod with a whole lot less flux on it. See how thin the flux is for all that rod. Look how paper thin that flux is compared to all this flux for such a small rod. This 7018 flux, it contains so many low hydrogen purification agents that correct damaged metal, unpure metal. This will purify it. I'm not going for purification now. I want steel. I want to put as much steel on this thing as fast as I can. And these rods right here are designed, these arc 80s are designed to run in a vertical down. I can start at the top and go down with these rods. So I can run a rod as big as a 3/16 on something the thickness of this truck frame. There's absolutely no way that you would want to run a 3/16 7018 vertical up on that frame. You'd have gonzos and goobers all to hell. But going downhill, the way these arc 80s are made to run, you can run this big 3/16 rod, and that'll give you the iron we need to get some work done. So that's what we're going to do, and that's up next. So I welded on that to change the shape of it. Trying to change the shape of it in a zigzag pattern or a Z pattern or some way that wouldn't allow it to start cracking and just rip. And it's one of them things where people see that and be like, oh, how do you know to do it that way? Well, I've just seen stuff crack, and I've fixed a lot of cracks. And when stuff's like that on a frame this way, it don't crack. Or if a crack starts, it don't go very far. When you weld up and down like they did on this frame, like we saw they did on here, when you do that, it cracks. So I'm going to see about what it takes to put this thing together. This was where the cracking was the worst. And another thing that makes me feel good about this is when I did my big Z right here, right there's where that hole was at. So that big hole that's plug welded solid from the inner frame to the outer frame also has this band of weld tying it in. The other thing is, you can probably tell this bracket for the air tanks, it got welded in. Obviously this edge, this one side of that got welded in. Whether that adds strength, it's not going to take anything away from it. It was just something that made it faster because I wanted to weld my zigzag there, and I didn't want to have to take this entire air tank assembly off and disconnect all the air lines. So it's good. I'm happy with it. I'm going to see what it takes to put the thing back together and see how that goes. This is a done deal. Everything's put back together. That air dryer's back on there, and this tank bracket on this side that I had off is reassembled there. So the way that was, the way they put that plate on the outside when they repaired that before, they put that plate on the outside of that thing and left both of the inner sections of broken frame broke. So you can see that by doing that, those inner sections of frame, they've been sitting there doing this on that plate. They were not, the two sections of double frame broke, and they replaced it with one plate that had bolts in the center and was welded at the ends. So those sections of frame where they've been broke, they've been sitting there doing that. Obviously that broke the welds at the end of the plate that they put on there. So they went from a double frame to a wobbling single frame deal. And it's amazing it lasted as long as it did. But the way it is now, with plug welds in the center on each side of the brake that go all the way through all three of those pieces of steel, and then plug welds on the outside giving you distance where you're holding something here and you're holding something here, that stops this motion from taking place. And then where it was cracked, I repaired, gouged out, and welded those cracks. And then by welding that zigzag pattern, that should have made it so that those molecules of metal, I guess, so to speak, aren't assembled in that vertical fashion where it's, where you would have an undercut. Every weld, I don't care how good you are, every weld has got an undercut at its edge. And on a frame, if you weld vertically, right where that undercut is, that's where that weld's going to crack. By zigzagging like that, it should have, that changes the molecular structure of the metal. I'm not a scientist or a metallurgist or anything like that. I see shit. I've seen a lot of metal that was broken, fixed it. So I know what holds and what don't. But this zigzag and these layers, the way that Z is, that's kind of like that's the same effect you get with when a blacksmith does a knife or a sword out of a Damascus steel, where he takes a whole bunch of pieces of steel and folds them together. That's extremely strong because every time one portion of that steel tries to break, it kind of T-bones into a piece of a different piece of steel with grains moving the other direction, and it stops that breakage. So that's kind of what we tried to do there. Man, to fix that right, that would be, I think, a 3-day fix. I just fixed that in 13 hours. I got 13 hours in it as of right now, and I've got it put back together, and I'm going to go out and start the truck. And you always got to check, and maybe I burned an airline that I didn't know I burned or something like that, but I think we're all good on that. So that one's done. That's the end of that deal, and y'all have a good one.